Glad you could join us today on EarthFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. 24 billion tons of fertile land is lost every year. And by 2025, the United Nations says 2/3 of the world will be living under water-stressed conditions when demand outstrips supply during certain periods. By that time, 1.8 billion people will experience absolute water scarcity, where a region's natural water resources are inadequate to supply the demand. Migration is likely to increase as a result of desertification, with the United Nations estimating that by 2045, it will be responsible for the displacement of some 135 million people. How this will happen is our focus today on EarthFile. Do stay with us. Desertification does not refer to the expansion of deserts, but rather the degradation of land in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhuman areas. Experts explain that it is primarily as a result of human activities and climatic variations. It happens that areas of dry land are extremely vulnerable to overexploitation and inappropriate land use. Poverty, political instability, deforestation, overgrazing, and bad irrigation practices can all undermine the productivity of the land. In a message to mark the 2019 World Day to combat desertification and drought, the United Nations Secretary-General warns that the degradation in land quality is responsible for a reduction in the national domestic product of up to 8% every year.
We must urgently change such trends. Protecting and restoring land and better using it can reduce forced migration, improve food security, and spur economic growth. It can also help us to address the global climate emergency. On this World Day, let us recognize the imperative of combating desertification as part of our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
The World Day, which raises awareness of international efforts to combat desertification, was established 25 years ago, along with the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the sole legally binding international agreement linking environment and development to sustainable land management. Running under the slogan, "Let's grow the future together," the 2019 World Day focuses on 3 key issues related to land. They are drought, human security, and climate.
25 years ago, the international community acknowledged the central role our land plays by creating the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Since then, 197 parties to the convention made significant achievements on sustainable land management in a coordinated fashion. However, there are much more needs to be done. For the next 25 years, I would have loved to say that as the only international treaty dealing with land management, we have our work cut out to turn that around before the population reaches 9 billion. But I can't. We simply don't have that long, because unless we rapidly get control of the land that underpins our biodiversity and provides the second largest carbon reservoir on this planet, we will trigger a series of reactions that puts the outcome entirely beyond our control. Which is why the world is determined that by 2030, we will switch from destroying the earth to making it productive enough to grow a better future for everyone.
The international community has acknowledged the central role our land plays in our lives and livelihoods. And since the creation of the convention, some 196 countries, including Brazil, Indonesia, China, and India, as well as the European Union, have signed up to coordinated actions for sustainable land management. However, there are even more stories about how poor land management has degraded an area twice the size of China and shaped a farming sector that contributes nearly a quarter of all greenhouse gases.
It is not just about sand. It is not an isolated issue that will quietly disappear, and it is not someone else's problem. It's about restoring and protecting the fragile layer of land which only covers 1/3 of the earth, but can either alleviate or accelerate the double-edged crisis facing our biodiversity and our climate. That makes it the problem of anyone who wants to eat, drink, or breathe, to make their home in a town, in the country, or even in security, to use technology, medicine, or infrastructure, to have equal access to work, learning, or relaxation, simply to live.
There are even more stories about how half the people on the planet are affected by damaged land or live in urban areas consuming resources that require 200 times as much land as their towns and cities and generating 70% of emissions.
If we take action to restore our degraded land, it will save $1.3 billion a day to invest in the education, equality, and clean energy that can reduce poverty, conflicts, and environmental migration. Better land management does not hold all the answers, but it offers a stepping stone to reach our goals by 2030 and then act as a natural multiplier of their benefits.
The Sahel is one of the most environmentally degraded regions in the world, with temperature increases projected to be 1.5 times higher than the global average. It is regularly hit by droughts and floods, which have enormous consequences on people's ability to earn a living and feed their families. The region consists of 10 different countries, totaling 300 million people. Currently, 33 million women, children, and men are food insecure, while more than 4.7 million children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. To build a sustainable peace in Africa, especially in its Sahel region, the United Nations Economic and Social Council and the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission, in their joint meeting in November 2018, said urgent attention is needed to mitigate the effect of climate change and ensure that communities have access to sufficient opportunities.
The risks associated with climate-related disasters do not represent a scenario of some distant future. They are already a reality for millions of people around the globe, and they are not going away. A report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last October predicted more heat waves, heavier rain events, higher sea levels, and more severe damage to agriculture. These trends represent a security risk for the entire world. However, their consequences are felt most strongly in regions that are already vulnerable, where climate change and extreme weather compound existing grievances and threats.
The meeting took place almost 2 months after 197 parties to the United Nations Climate Change Convention agreed to a concrete way forward on implementing the 2015 Paris Agreement, which aims to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and ahead of the United Nations Secretary-General's Climate Summit, which we hold on the 23rd of September 2019. Whether climate change is an issue that should be examined by the United Nations Peace and Security Body to begin with has been the subject of controversy. Some member states believe that this is stepping on the toes of other United Nations entities, specifically mandated with taking a lead on social and economic development or environmental protection. The first ever meeting of the Security Council examining the linkages between climate change and insecurity happened in April 2007. Since then, the UN body has increasingly taken steps that effectively acknowledge that the two issues are related. In July 2011, another open debate on the matter was held. In March 2017, Resolution 2349 was adopted, highlighting the need to address climate-related risks in order to tackle the conflict in the Lake Chad Basin. And in July 2018, a debate was held on understanding and addressing climate-related security risks.
For the Security Council, this is not news. In recent months, the Council has recognized the adverse effects of climate change, among other factors, on the stability of Mali, Somalia, West Africa and the Sahel, Central Africa and the Sudan. The Secretary General, for his part, has articulated a broad vision for prevention and made it a priority to improve our ability to address wider stresses and shocks that can exacerbate crises and lead to violent conflict.
In a sign of how important the discussion is to many countries, the debate was attended by over 70 member states and included statements in the Council chamber from a dozen ministers, including Kuwait, Belgium, Indonesia, Germany, and Poland.
Climate change is real. It is having a global impact. And it is increasingly becoming a threat to international peace and security. This is why the debate about the policy consequences of climate change belongs here, in the Security Council. It must become routine for us to take the link between climate and security into account in all conflict situations. We should focus on three aspects. First, all United Nations member states need access to reliable and comprehensive information. This is why systematic reporting by the Secretary General on the security-related impacts of climate change is so important. Second, the Security Council needs sound risk analysis and forecasts with clear recommendations for action. Our Swedish friends have strengthened the capacities of the UN system to this end, and we want to continue along this path. And third, we must work even harder to translate our knowledge about climate change into tangible policy in the mandates of the United Nations missions and, above all, in the work of the United Nations in the field.
Refugees in African nations are part of the more than 70 million people who have had to leave their homes, the highest number ever recorded, including 25.9 million refugees, 41.3 million internally displaced persons, and 3.5 million asylum seekers. As the global refugee crisis is playing out in Europe, with the influx of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan and Iraq, and other places is catching the attention of the international community and the media, the African continent is witnessing an unprecedented influx of refugees, internally displaced persons and asylum seekers crossing borders to neighboring countries. On his part, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees described Africa as a humanitarian theater, referring to the recently published Global Trends report from the UN Refugee Agency, which shows a significant increase in the number of people in Africa forced to flee their homes.
Rising forced displacement is the symptom of such a crisis in the Sahel, especially in the West Africa part of the Sahel. Malian refugees still remaining in countries neighboring Mali have stopped returning to Mali. There was some momentum there up to a couple of years ago. The deterioration of the situation has prevented further returns. We have seen a rise in displacement in both Burkina Faso and Niger. That situation can only be responded through to a more strategic combination of security and development interventions in support of governments of the region. I'd like to also flag very briefly in this context northeast Nigeria. There too, the momentum that we had a couple of years ago with the beginning of return of displaced people and refugees to the northeast of the country has somehow slowed down, and the region continues to be the theater of very large displacement. We owe it, I would say, to millions of ordinary Africans in villages, in towns, in cities, who out of sense of duty, out of cultural tradition, out of their own values, keep their door open, share their often scarce resources. Their solidarity, unlike in other parts of the world, is not the subject of political debate. But it would be a great mistake on our part to take that generosity for granted, because it has a very high cost and we need to share that burden.
And while better land management does not hold all the answers, it offers a stepping stone to reach global goals by 2030 and then act as a natural multiplier of their benefits. In the Lake Chad region, where climate change and shortages of water and food that come from it is becoming increasingly linked to conflict, the drastic shrinking of Lake Chad by more than 90% since the 1960s has led to environmental degradation. social economic marginalization and insecurity, affecting 45 million people. Exacerbated competition over scant resources and the vicious cycle of risk and vulnerability have decreased the resilience of populations to cope with humanitarian crises. Declining economic activity and agricultural loss have led to a lack of employment opportunities across the region. The resulting socio-economic marginalization has exposed populations in the area, in particular the young people, to the risk of violent extremism and provided breeding ground for recruitment by groups such as Boko Haram.
Climate change affects peace and security in indirect but no less serious ways. In the Sahel and the Sudan, for instance, climate change has heightened competition for diminishing land, forage, and water resources, fueling tensions between herders and farmers. In the Lake Chad Basin, climate change contributes to unpredictable rainfall patterns that impede traditional livelihood options, compound socioeconomic exclusion, and reduce the opportunity costs of joining armed groups. Climate-related displacement has also become an acute problem. Frequent and longer droughts in Somalia have been a major factor in the displacement of more than 2.6 million people, which in turn have increased local tensions as well as human trafficking, child exploitation, and recruitment by armed groups.
The Boko Haram insurgency in northeast Nigeria and neighboring countries of Cameroon, Chad, and Niger has left over 10 million people displaced and resulted in massive destruction of basic infrastructure, health and educational facilities, commercial buildings, private houses, and agricultural assets. The United Nations believes the multidimensional nature of this crisis underlines the complex relationship between climate change and conflict.
Climate change is an aggravating factor. We call it a risk multiplier. Especially the Lake Chad region, I think this is an area where you have many different factors intersecting. So there's also a legacy of poor governance. There are certain agricultural policies that have been negative in the past. There's a big man-made dimension to the degradation of natural resources, and on top of that you have conflict and you have climate extremes. So it's I would say a very complex mesh of factors. And when you look at our programs in the Lake Chad region, a lot of it is still emergency related. So there are fires breaking out everywhere, you know, metaphorically. So people are in trouble in one part of the country here and another part of the country there. So we are caught in a pattern of repetitive humanitarian response. And it's very difficult in this context to establish a risk management approach to the crisis, which we would normally need. It's a bit easier to work in countries that do not have conflict. Countries like Malawi, for example, are easier to work with on risk management than, for example, DR Congo. And you know, middle-income countries have also certain capacities that least developed countries do not have. So every country is different. But in the Lake Chad Basin, I would say that climate change is a risk multiplier, like in many other places, but it's not a linear reason for that conflict.
In turn, high levels of poverty and low levels of human development limit the capacity of poor people to manage climate risks, placing further stress on already overstretched coping mechanisms that will perpetuate poverty traps. Taken together, this means the potential for an increase in eco-migrants, disease outbreaks such as the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and increased instability. Perhaps most importantly, climate change is putting the lives of millions of people at risk in Africa. For the first time in over a decade, world hunger is on the rise, affecting 11% of the global population, according to recent estimates from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Conflict and climate are the main drivers for this spike in hunger.
Climate change is affecting every country, but countries that rely predominantly on agriculture feel it the most. Agriculture is all about climate-sensitive natural resources. It's about crops, it's about water, it's about livestock, it's about fish stock. And so if you have a country that relies 40 to 50% of their GDP on agriculture, then this is a very strong factor that determines vulnerability to climate extremes. And climate change can come in at the production side, where crops and livestock face heat stress, for example, so there are lower crop yields. but it can also come in after the production. So when, for example, storage systems are being disrupted, when access to market gets disrupted by flooding, by landslides. So in all stages of an agricultural value chain, climate change can come in and create a problem. And that overall also affects the food systems in countries, especially in those that rely on agriculture.
In Africa, crop destruction from the fall armyworm, strong droughts induced by an abnormally strong El Nino cycle, and a rise in conflict in places such as Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan were the chief culprit in a serious rise in food insecurity in 2017. At the peak of the El Nino crisis from 2014 to 2016, some 40 million people in Africa required emergency assistance. The number dropped to around 26 million in 2017.
I think a lot starts with communicating about the economics of climate change. So when you discuss with the Ministry of Agriculture how climate change affects food systems, food prices, it's good to have data. It's good to have economic data from the past as much as what climate change models tell you about agriculture in the future. And then you need to link that data with money. It's eventually a big hit that Argentina is taking. It's a big hit that the US is taking through the storms. So everyone is affected, but unless you can translate it into US dollar figures, very often there is not enough attention on the issue.
As a designated financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Global Environment Facility continues to be at the forefront of international efforts to strengthen developing countries' resilience to climate change.
We came to realize that the projects that we are financing are good projects for the most part. They deliver generally the objectives that they were supposed to do, but they are not adding up. They are not helping to transform the systems that need transformation in order for us to reach these targets. So in this cycle, we developed a new policy through which we can bring resources closer together and start designing projects and programs that speak across different sectors and speak across different themes. So when you're talking about biodiversity, you have to talk about land use and how agriculture is taking place at the landscape scale. When you talk about emissions, we know that between 25 and 40% of all emissions today are due to deforestation added with agriculture. So without that, we won't achieve the results. So we decided to integrate more the financing that we provide.
The Global Environment Facility Small Grant Program successfully showed that community-based groups established to share common experiences and concerns about climate change lead to better and more resilient practices. But all too often, projects need trained, experienced, and motivated implementation staff for effective design and implementation of adaptation measures. Weak project planning, financial management, and reporting are other factors leading to implementation gaps.
LDCs have special needs and capacity. Sometimes it's not there. Of course, we work through accredited agencies, and they should know all the details on how applications work and what is eligible, what not eligible. But we also reach out to countries, and we have promoted what we call national dialogues, and we have also organized what we call extended constituency workshops, in which we bring our technical staff, we guide participants, which are different government agencies, NGOs, at the country level, to understand all these aspects. So we organize literally 3 or 4 of these a month now, everywhere in the world. We are, on the other hand, a very small unit. We are one secretariat housed in one place with 65 people.
The importance of ensuring that land is well managed is noted in the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which declares that we are determined to protect the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resources and taking urgent action on climate change so that it can support the needs of the present and future generations. That's our program for the week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.